Please welcome Tony Hodge.
Some months ago, Ian invited me to participate in this conversation. We didn't know whether we would put it together and whether we could thread the needle that it meant threading. We did. I don't know if Ian and Chris and Tim, the board members, realize it's a very dangerous thing to do, to put me in front of a group of people like this, especially in this very privileged position of kicking off a meeting, and particularly because you're dealing with issues that are close to my heart, and there's a tremendous amount of, on the one hand, evolution going on with these ideas, and on the other hand, we're dealing with an industry that's moving into, quite frankly, a retrenchment mode, and I'll come back to that. I too want to signal my appreciation to the traditional people and their elders, past and present, whose traditional territory this building is on. Ian, I want to thank in particular IM4DC. Quite frankly, this grouping of people, if IM4DC did nothing else, this network that you've created is an astonishing result for your work. I know of only 2 other such networks that bring together people concerned with mining in the world, and one would be found in the bowels of the United Nations, and the United Nations is not particularly functional right now, which is very unfortunate. The Intergovernmental Forum meets in Geneva annually and brings together mining ministries from countries interested in mining around the world, and it's an important forum. But what you have here and the interactions and the collaboration that this is fostering will mean more to change across the industry and across emerging nations than anything else that I know of. So I'm very appreciative of being here. I'm appreciative of the invitation. I'm appreciative of the leadership that IM4DC is offering the world, not only in the conversation of the panel after this, but in real action, which is very special. So I'm going to quickly run through 4 things. I'm going to give you a context and provide an overview of the industry in a way that, for some reason, it's very simple, but for some reason we don't see very often. I'm going to then zero in on this issue of mining's contribution, which, Majali, you picked up, and it means a great deal to me that you did do that. Interestingly, I come from the Pacific Northwest of North America, and it's true, I cannot claim to be a member of an Aboriginal community. But my wife and I share eagle and raven, and my wife wears hummingbird. So thank you very much for raising that. I'm then going to talk about poverty and the role of mining in poverty, and the reason is, certainly one of the lessons at ICMM that I've come to understand is that you can't do everything all at once. And the issue to make a difference in terms of mining and development is, in my view, the poverty issue. It's at the core of it. There are other things that are very critical, but that is at the core of it. And mining's role in poverty alleviation, in my view, is going to set the stage for how fast mining does or doesn't move in terms of showing leadership on the development stage. And you will see that in ICMM we have a program called Mining Partnerships for Development, and mining as a partner in development is definitely the way of the world. And I will return at the very end to talk about the lessons that I have learned on that front and to answer the question about what is mining's role in development moving forward. So, an overview of mining in the world. This is a map we produced a couple of years ago in October. It will be updated with any luck and a bit of hard work to give you a sense of where mining is really happening across the world. One of the big evolutions that you are very aware of, that we are very aware of, is that the center of gravity of mining activities has moved from the developed world into emerging nations. This is a table that always surprises people. We forget the relative nature of mined quantities. Now, I must tell you that if we put sand, gravel, and cut stone on this, it would blow it all out of the ground. But people forget the relative size. In any case, this is interesting because it shows you both about physical change that's wrought by mining activities and the value in the world economy. And I draw your attention to the coal and iron ore, and obviously here in Australia, these are poignant issues. But I also draw you to the link to the climate change debate, because obviously some amount of the coal is met coal that is used in the iron ore and the steel process, and they're linked. But the value of those two commodities in the world economy is massive. The number of employed people across the world that are dependent on that is extraordinary. So in the climate change debate, and I am very much a person that believes that we have to play our role in the climate change issue. Don't need to back away that at all. But for those involved in the climate change discussion, to just simply say that we should turn off the tap of coal, it's not going to happen. There are too many people, too many communities, too many families dependent on that across the world. There has to be an ordered transition, and it's a terrific challenge. I very much appreciate the comments made earlier about ICMM's role in the mining industry. But in fact, they're untrue. We have 22 mining companies around the table of ICMM on the council in which I sit. Those 22 companies have operations across the world. As I'll show you on a map just a minute, there's about 800 operations in about 70 countries, and they employ about 1 million people. And in the formal mining sector around the world, as best we can estimate, there are about 2.5 million people. Now, put that in context. Compare that to the artisanal and small-scale miners. There are, depending on the prices of commodities and the activities, the estimates that the World Bank comes up with are in the order of 30, 40, 50, 60 million people. So way more people at the artisanal and small-scale issue. So I'm very, very glad that you put your finger on that, because it's an issue that at ICMM, we dance around, but it's hugely important, and potentially, from a social and environmental perspective, more important than everything that we deal with at ICMM. So don't lose that context, but also don't lose this context. There are 22 companies at ICMM. In the formal mining sector, and these are statistically significant companies around the world, there are about 6,000. So we have 22 companies out of 6,000. Now, the million out of 2.5 million tells you that these 22 companies, and quite frankly, this reflects the commodities as well. 30, 40, 50% of the commodities come through our companies. But there are many, many other players, and an issue that we deal with. It's all very well to say companies, large company does something in terms of good practices or moving towards good practice, and the small companies may not. But it doesn't mean that the big guys are good guys and the small companies are bad guys. It doesn't mean that at all, because some small companies are doing very good things. But there is a tail in the industry. We do have leaders and laggards and corporate couch potatoes halfway in between. We do. And one of our problems is, how do we take leadership positions on issues that are very important from an environmental and social performance perspective and ripple that across the industry? How do we bring the tail up? That may be the most significant challenge we face, and I don't know the answer to it. Oops. So a few things about what's going on in the world. I'm not going to dwell on these. Prices dance all over the place. This is to give you a sense of changing prices and costs over time, declining grades that are typical. Projects are becoming more and more complex, bigger, more difficult to plan. That's the regime in which chief executive officers and management teams of mining companies have to make their decisions. This dance of prices, this continually rising costs, changing regulatory systems across the world, and that will not stop, incidentally. The history of regulation is always that as society learns, they bring in rules to address the new knowledge that they have, which means changes in regulation. And quite frankly, the plea of the mining industry to just set the rules and leave it the same will never, never happen. Rules will change, and the good companies manage to changing rules and manage to understand what they think those changing rules will be. Another thing that's very, very important from a contextual point of view is to realize that mining is not simply the operation at which point companies and governments can try to hive off more tax revenues, which is the big debate across the world. A 30-year operating mine translates today to 100, 150 years of interaction between mining company and a community. If you look at the exploration up front, the design and implementation, the operation, the reclamation phase, and then the long-term closure, which depends completely on the setting, the geochemical setting, the hydrologic setting, the environmental and ecological setting. This is a long-term proposition. And there are some tremendous tensions that the industry faces because the investor community, who are guiding the investments of a very large number of people who put their money into pension funds that end up being the investors that provide the money for these, the investor community is interested in annual return. Our decision-making on mining has to look at the longer term in terms of the project pipeline, in terms of the distribution of revenues that occur only during the operating phase, allow for money to do exploration to find new facilities, but allow for costs expended across the post-closure phase, which can be very, very large. So it's an art as much as a science. And interestingly, inside the mining industry, and I certainly realize this, and Ian, I'm sure you recall that, you go back to the 80s and 90s, there was no talk about post-closure in mining operation. You finished, you hopefully planted some grass, and you hopefully got an exit permit. In my view, that will never happen again. I don't think any government in the world is now going to give an exit permit because of the lingering liabilities that have occurred, which will come up at our conversation on Wednesday at the Life of Mine conference. So ICMM, very quickly, we're a catalyst for improving things. It's very different than a typical industry association. We were charged with facilitating the implementation of a action plan that came out of a discussion in the early 2000s involving some 50,000 people around the world. So the mining industry didn't create our agenda. It was created by a broad conversation involving people from communities, indigenous people, civil society, academics, people from large and small companies across the world. And that's what we've been working on. Of course, it's moved on since then. These are our companies. You'll recognize those. These are the principles that our companies commit to. They report out against their performance against these principles on an annual basis in a third-party assured, independently assured reporting process, much like financial auditing. And that process is thrust ICMM in an interesting way, because this has changed in the 6 years since I've been at ICMM. Our companies now think of us as setting a standard to which they work to. A very interesting thing happened, and I'll use this as a segue now to move into my conversation about development. In October last year, we go through a budgeting process. And in October last year, having done a whole lot of thinking about what we should do in 2014, this year, October 2013, Council said, we have to rethink this because something's not working. And the issue that mining is not getting a handle on is the relationship between operations and communities in the field. And they said we should reorient our entire focus, and this is a hugely good step as far as I'm concerned, to think about what we as an industry need to do to strengthen those relationships between mining operations and communities on the ground. Very, very quickly, I want to say something about change. You people are in the business of change. IM4DC is in the business of change. You are here because of that, and the leadership that has been mentioned many times takes us into that. And yet, we never stop to think about the change phenomena. We leap to figuring out what we want to do. And I plead with you, if there's one message from here, I plead with you to think for a moment about the change phenomena and think about the drivers of change, what's resistance to change, what roles as a change agent one can play, and what strategies of change work at any given time. And I'm going to just pick up a little bit of this to tell you about a few things. Drivers of change. Obviously, across the world, we're seeing, whether the industry recognizes this or not, we're seeing an increasing concern about fragile Earth. We're seeing an increase in concern about social justice. If we don't realize that that's going on around us, we just disconnect from society. The geopolitical instability is affecting change across the world and could affect the supply-demand picture. Obviously, population, urbanization, and so forth, I'll come back to that. Let me talk to you a little bit about resistance to change. People don't like change naturally. If it's the way they've done it for a long period of time, they're not interested in it. If we've always done it that way and it's not broken, why fix it? And I don't raise this facetiously. When you're talking about your governments, your communities, your companies, that really comes to you in the face, these personal factors. Economic volatility. The economic volatility in 2008 has kicked off a degree of caution in the mining industry that is leading today to an overall climate of cost-cutting. It's rampant in the industry. We're feeling it amongst our members. You're feeling it. So it's a very, very major issue that we have to deal with in terms of change, because people just want to cut. And it's short-termism back in place. Change agent roles. I'll give you two examples here, and these are all very distinct roles. Greenpeace, like the troubadours of the 15th century, is a catalyst. They're out in front. They're telling people what the issues are, obviously, that they are concerned about. Now, you may not agree with them, but to ignore them as a signal that something is going on out there, you do so at your peril. Engineers are solution builders. I'm an engineer. I'm not going to climb a smokestack. They're different roles. The networking phenomena of this group is another role as a change agent. And the issue comes that if you're playing a catalytic role, and oftentimes environmental people, the NGO community, by companies in order to engage, has been drawn from a catalytic role into a solution building role. And quite frankly, NGOs are not very good at that. They don't have the technical expertise to do that. If we push them into that role, it won't work very well. So you have to be strategic, and I urge, and there's a great deal to think about in here to be effective. I do want to now very, very quickly talk about the issues going on around the world, some of the key issues going on around the world. I can't see this, so I don't know what I'm speaking to. These are fairly self-explanatory. I want to pick up a few of them. The antagonism that is being expressed by communities and people across the world, not only to mining, but go deeper than that. The antagonism being expressed at the evil multinational corporation is a very significant issue. We bang up against that. We can do good things, but eventually we bang up against that. And I think it's an issue that we're all going to have to deal with at some time. Not to deny it, because I think there are some real concerns under that, but we have to begin dealing with it. A very important phenomena going on around the world. 15 years ago, we talked about all sorts of things that I would call concerns. They are now in a bundle of rights. The movement of the rights-based approach, which is really taking a litigative, rules-based approach, quite frankly, from American and French-based political economy, and bringing that out to other countries who may not have grown up in that mode, is significant across the world right now. Interestingly, in contrast to that, we are finding that civil society is much more interested in collaborative activity than they were 10 years ago. And there is a movement, I believe, and very much exemplified by the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, to work formally with multi-party organizations and instruments that would bring together government, business and civil society. And someone mentioned that earlier. I think you mentioned that also in your comments. There's a definite formalization of that and more of that happening. And in my view, it's the way of the future. A huge change. And this is pivotal. And that is that the communications going on around the world, the connectedness between communities, individuals across the world has changed the landscape completely. The Sami of northern Finland are talking to the Kalahari Bushmen. The communities of East Africa are talking to the communities of Australia and North America. It's all connected. And there is a huge implication of that. And the implication is, in my view, that it is serving to empower communities. It's giving them knowledge and expertise and access to that they've never had before. And in the process of that, they're being empowered. So governments and companies operating in remote areas, typical of the mining industry, can no longer steamroller communities rather. Communities are standing up and want to be heard. In my view, that's a very good development, not a bad development. I'll come back to that. Interestingly, we see something that I think might be a paradox. We're in a conversation with some people about this right now. Because I look over the last 10 years and see huge improvement in company performance. I know that for a fact, and it is anecdotal, to be fair. But I see companies doing things now that they wouldn't have even thought about doing 10 years ago. I go to mining industry conferences all over the world, and I hear the topics of conversation, topics which would have been considered extremist topics a decade ago are now front and center. The issues that you're dealing with here in terms of community and collaboration and leadership. At the same time, and this is very important, we are seeing a terrific increase in conflict around the world. Real conflict on the ground. This is an exponential increase in conflict between communities and mining operations across the world. And this is tremendously worrisome. I just got my 10-minute signal. That's quite helpful. Because at the one hand, we see companies doing better, but we see an increase in conflict. I don't think we understand that yet. We have a project at ICMM really getting in at this, and I'm sure that we'll learn a great deal in the years to come. We know that when you go underneath it, there are many different reasons for each individual conflict. And when I say conflict, you have to be careful to define that term. And the way I'm using it is this, because any new activity in a community will lead to tension as people are not sure what's coming in. People will question. And the concept of conflict, in a sense, starts with that kind of tension and then there is a spectrum of conflict from that point all the way across to the other end of the spectrum where actual death occurs, physical violence and death. Now these incidents that we're talking about here are incidents that involves the physical use of force, physical change. So, and the compilation of incidents here for the year 2000, well, those are by years, are very conservative. And people have certainly questioned this data from us and said, well, it may well be that back in 2002, we simply weren't registering the conflict that has occurred, and there may be reality to that. But I also know for a fact, I showed this to a company in India, and they looked at this and said, well, you obviously haven't looked at India here because the entire state of Goa is shut down right now because of community mining conflict. So this is very conservative data, and we're very comfortable in showing this, but the issue is very real. I want to talk now about the issue of mining contribution. Across the world, when you hear the debate about the resource curse issue, the argument is, of course, that the local people have not received a fair part of the resource rents coming from mining, and I think there is very, very real, there is real substantiation of that. On the other hand, what you hear from the leaders of the countries rather, is that we want more tax and revenue from mining. We want more of the cut. And to me, this is very, very frustrating. The concept of contribution, which is an idea that actually has been mooted over the past 10 years, is not simply about tax revenues. I think the mining industry has itself to blame in a certain extent, because if you ask mining CEOs what they give, they say taxes. So the mining industry for a long, long time has given a message that what the real benefit is taxes. So now it's not surprising to me that government leaders come back and say they want more taxes. But when you look at the reality of it, the benefit of mining, particularly in emerging nations, the greatest benefit of mining currently is not revenue to government. It's the attraction of foreign direct investment and the attraction of foreign earnings, which allows a country to participate in the international market to the benefit of that country. And if you look at this triangle, and the most recent manifestation of this, and I urge you to look at it, is some work that we did in Zambia that was released just a few months ago by the Vice President of Zambia. You see that if you really want to make a difference, if you're a government leader and you really want to make a difference, you go to the bottom of this triangle where the local benefits are currently placed, and if you really want to change that, you have to work to enhance the local benefits. You'll see under local benefits up there a series of things, all of which you'll be very familiar with. This is a kind of standard thinking about what those are. Set that aside for a minute. The concept of contribution, and I'll come back to that, is looking at the benefits is only half the equation. And the distributional issue that communities feel gets focused on those benefits, but there is another part of it, and that is also the distribution of the costs and risks. And the worst situation is when one party gets all the benefits and another party carries all the costs and risks. And the third part of it that you have to keep in mind is that the distribution of who is responsible for doing what. And the fourth part is whether or not those individuals or companies or groups responsible for ensuring that the costs and risks are well managed and the benefits are achieved, if the accountabilities are not in place to ensure that those who are responsible are discharging those responsibilities to manage the cost and risks to achieve the benefits, things break down. We tend to argue about the benefits. We tend to argue about one tiny little part of the benefits, which is tax and royalty revenue. And I urge you, in thinking about this and taking it back to your countries to think about that broader equation. Let me talk to you bizarrely on the accountability issue. Across the world right now, and it's coming up in the discussion of the SDGs, people talk about holding companies to account. And this is coming from the concerns about the out-of-control evil multinational corporations. We want to make them reboard out and hold them to account. Well, I can tell you, companies are actually very used to being held to account. They'll argue about the details of reporting, and they'll push back when you want to do more, and they'll push back when you've got to layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, but they're totally used to reporting out. That's not where the problem lies. It's the others in the equation. How do we hold, and I hate to say this, Rebecca, governments to account? People say, well, ballot box 4 years from now. It's not good enough. The Marikana issue in South Africa, which is oftentimes pigeonholed as a company issue, is as much a government issue as a company issue. It is as much a community issue as a company issue as a government issue. The responsibility and the distribution of the responsibilities across that, and the holding of people to account for commitments, in that case, for social housing and social conditions, was never done. From a mining perspective, of course, the mining company is what takes it in the ear, and they have a certain amount of responsibility, there's no doubt about it, but there are others. And it's this breadth of recognizing the responsibilities and holding to people to account. Also from a mining company point of view and a government point of view. Talk about responsibilities, a huge problem facing the industry is the lack of clear definition of who is responsible for what when. Company goes into emerging country, there's a tremendous need for health facilities, transportation, communication, water, sewage. Company wants to get going. They have their investors breathing down their back. They will put money into those things. Their staff are close by. The equipment is there. What happens when the government has to take over maintenance? How is that worked out? What is the boundary of responsibility? When is that going to take place? How is government going to pay for that? Those are critical issue. And what are we doing? Arguing about tax revenues. It's a tiny part of the larger equation that we have to think about. I've mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals very quickly now because we're a bit tight on time. I do want to share with you something coming at two directions. 2013, McKinsey's came out with a wonderful report called Reversing the Curse, and I urge you to have a look at it. It's a good piece of work, and in which they proposed a 6-part approach to reversing the curse, to making sure that there was a better distribution, a fairer distribution of benefits from mining. Just a few months ago, a fellow by the name of Jim Cooney came out with a paper, and Jim's a former vice president of Placer Dome, has had lots and lots of experience here in Australia, incidentally, who came at this from a different direction. And I came to know about this because of conversations we're currently involved with, believe it or not, with the Vatican about mining, which is now moving forward into conversations with the Church of England, the Methodist Church, the Muslim religion, the Jewish faith, and so forth, in a broad faith community outreach that we're engaged with. This comes at it from a different direction and thinks about it from what's going on at the community level. And Cooney, who is deeply understanding and was a vice president of a major mining company, points out these things. Mining is at the periphery. They understand poverty. They come face to face with it all the time. They know that if they lose connection with the community, it can have a big hit on their profitability and on their reputation. Companies know that. It is not new. And many companies adopt the kinds of strategy that McKinsey came up listed, working with government to try and enhance local benefits. There is a fundamental issue. If you're a company and you go into a community, who do you interact with? You interact with the people in the community who speak your language, who understand, who if you phone, they'll phone you back the next day. It's the leadership in the community. They're the people that are already well off. So the mining activity, almost by definition, ends up interacting with the leadership in the community, generally with the people who are already well off. The marginalized people are less capable. Without realizing it, the mining company chooses to link with the people that most effectively link with them. Well, the effect of that is that without realizing it, without an effective strategy to really think about it, you interact with the rich in the community and not the poor. The result of which is, overall, even though there are more resources going into a community, the rich get richer faster than the poor get richer. So even though the absolute poverty level of the community might have improved, the inequity, the gap between the rich and the poor, by the very presence of the mining activity, is exacerbated. And I urge you to think about this, because this is coming at it from a different direction. It's coming at it from the bottom. The McKinsey folks operating way up here are coming from the top. This is now getting at the real issues on the ground. And Cooney proposed, well, you can read that. Sorry. Cooney proposed a strategy which is very interesting, given that the Sustainable Development Goals' top priority is going to be poverty alleviation. The policy of Your ministry, Rebecca, here in Australia, is poverty reduction on the international stage. So what role companies, what can we do about it? And what this is saying is that we've got to turn our mind upside down and work explicitly on thinking about poverty reduction and the marginalized people in communities in a way we have never done before. This has to be put in the context of the real priority that companies have of benefiting shareholders. There is a tension there that we have to resolve. After it's all over, what does this all mean? And I can tell you, this is very, very interesting for me at this stage, not only in this evolution of ideas that I've painted for you, but in the evolution of the 6 years since I've been at ICMM. Because at this stage, when I'm around the world and I say, so what? What have you learned? What is the key thing for mining industries moving forward, mining companies right now? Truly is these three things. The first one is, for mining companies, and this has effect for human resource training, it has effect for strategies on the ground, it has effect for implications for corporate strategy and decision making. The key success factor for mining companies moving forward is building relationships with local communities that are marked by integrity, respect, and authenticity. And that is not the skill of geological engineers like me. But that's the key success factor for mining companies. Secondly, you cannot legislate that. The government of Australia cannot make rules that do that. Aboriginal people that want to demand FPIC, in the belief that that will bring them respect and the opportunity to participate as equals in decision-making, will not get that from rules. It will come from the relationships and the attitudes of the people in the companies and the communities, and an ability to work together collaboratively. And I leave you with this final point, and that is that if you want to know how to do this, don't come to London. Don't come to Brisbane. Go to the communities at the periphery where it's working, because there are wonderful success stories out there. That's where the real insight is. It's out in the communities, it's not in the big cities. Thank you very much, Ian.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. Tony has challenged us and left us with an excellent final message, which certainly rings bells for me. So, one thing I know about IM40C alumni and other alumni is that there is no lack of questions and discussion. We have some roving microphones. Aileen and Julie will bring them to you. We'll take 3 initial questions, then we'll see how we go, if we can take any more, but there will be more time for discussion. So, questions, 3 questions quickly of Tony. IM40C alumni. I didn't want to use PowerPoint to go to sleep. So, do we have a question? I'm going to throw it to Indonesia. Where's Indonesia? Rena? Indonesia. Okay, we'll have a question, Julie, please, from your neighbours, Indonesia. Do you have a question of Tony? Then I'm going to throw to the Philippines. So that's question 2, and then there'll be a third question. All right, we'll pick that in a moment. So please, Indonesia.
Thank you, Ian. My question addressed to Dr. Anthony Hodge. In Indonesia, especially in my province, there are not many mining companies considered the participation from the local community, and also then not many of them consider of how to empower the local community. So what do you suggest for our country?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Okay, from the Philippines, please. Next question, and then we'll get Tony to answer all 3.
To the presentation of Dr. Anthony, Thank you for that. I just want to know the position of the ICMM because you adopt the RUGI principle of business in human rights, the respect, the whole guiding principles. And now the Human Rights Council passed a resolution to, I think there is a binding principle now that the Human Rights Council have passed. So what is the position of the ICMM on this issue?
Okay, one more question from Africa, from Zambia.
Thank you. I followed your speech there. You said that local development, or is it local content, could be an alternative to mine taxation. Now, I'm looking at a situation in Zambia where the mining companies probably are not compelled, to develop the local communities. While on the other hand, they are not even, paying the required taxes. I don't know how that can work, or what's your view on that?
Sorry, I didn't understand that. Not paying the required taxes. Is that correct? Not paying the required
We are not
taxes?
getting taxes, and then there is no policy to make mining companies contribute to the community. It's like it's not compulsory for them.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Thanks.
Actually, I can, the first question and this last question, in a sense, are related because the empowerment issue and then the lack of, if companies are not being, if the enforcement is not in place for companies to pay taxes, that's an issue. The issue of not enough taxes and whether there is enough taxes being paid is yet another issue. So let me talk on these two, and then I'll come back to the human rights question in a second. The people that study negotiation and contract law know, and the business schools teach, that a good agreement is made by strong partners. People that are good in business know that. There is, in fact, every incentive for companies to put in place and put at the disposal of communities resources to make them stronger partners. Because, in fact, the agreement that emerges from stronger partners is a more long-lasting agreement. And the risk that is paramount for companies is that you agree on something today and 3 years down the road all the conditions change and they've got to start all over again. And if they are dealing with that long-term requirement for thinking that has to deal with the allocation of resources and the revenues over a long period of time, the changing conditions is what really is hard to handle. So there is a huge risk that if agreements with communities break down, that all breaks down. So there is an incentive for companies, a big incentive, to work with communities to empower them. Now, the industry we work with right now doesn't completely understand that. The good companies do, but the industry doesn't understand that. So we are in a process of change where we are dealing and serving as change agents in an industry where a bunch of the companies are still of the mindset that it's best if they just control everything and paternalistically tell people what to do. And that's why the empowerment of communities across the world is so significant, because it is changing that. And the good companies are embracing this change because they recognize that stronger, more long-lasting agreements are made between strong partners. It serves them for communities to be stronger. It serves them to provide technical resources defined by the community at the disposal of communities so they can be strong partners. But this is an issue that I'm sure you're going to have more conversation about in IM4DC. The taxes issue, two parts of it. If companies do not pay taxes, that's a legal issue. It's a legal issue in this country as much as your country, no different. So there has to be enforcement mechanisms to ensure that that happens. And the enforcement, the lack of enforcement or the presence of enforcements may be it may be a capacity issue that's very significant in some emerging nations. Whether or not taxes are enough that are being paid is another issue, and there's a big debate upon that. And on the human rights issue that was asked about over here, we have been hugely involved with Ruggie's work. Aidan Davey, my deputy, was a personal advisor to John Ruggie on the framework that's come out of that. We've had very close interaction with the Human Rights Council that you mentioned. We have a position statement that modifies our commitments, that deals with our commitment as an organization and as companies to respecting these agreements. So it's very central to the ICMM psyche, if you wish, and culture.